My grandfather, our grandfather. That's what I've been asked to talk about today because we just celebrated our 69th anniversary at Bank Pacific and Mariana's Finance Corporation. Mama used to run Mariana's Finance. I remember that. Okay, so August 12th, my grandfather would have been 123. He was born in Ghana. He joined the Navy when he was 17, and that was World War I. He was discharged in San Diego, met my grandmother, and well, I moved to San Francisco first, and then he met my grandmother. Her family was from Acapulco, and she was born in San Francisco. My sisters, myself, both our grandmothers were born in San Francisco. But her family came up from Mexico in the 1890s, something like that. And when my grandfather, after the Second War, he had two brothers, one of which is Ama's father, and the brothers had a store in Naganya where the bank is now, called Flores Brothers. And they kept telling my grandfather, come out, there's money to be made here, which there was in the post-construction area of World War II, or the post-war era. He said making money back then was as easy as getting up and taking a breath, because there was just so much going on. And one of the biggest things, when you get him to sit down and reminisce, there was a big elephant Quonset, if everybody knows what that is, a Quonset hut, huge one, and it was full of stale beer. And the military was gonna throw it over the cliff, literally. And they said, no, we'll buy it. And so he said the pickup truck went back and forth all day, and because the construction workers didn't care if the beer was spoiled or not, they would buy it. And I asked my grandmother one time, I said, Grandma, because they moved back to Guam pretty much full time in '48. And although he would come back and forth to San Francisco a lot, how could you, having grown up in San Francisco, relatively modern city, especially back then, at the age of 48, move to Guam, where sometimes you had to wonder if you're going to get water out of the shower. And if the water did come, what color was it going to be? And very Spanish at first, she goes, because you went, your husband did. Oh, okay. He was pretty strict. Amma will tell you that. Lynn will tell you that. Shirley will tell you that. Shirley, one time when she was working for him, we had another lady there, Anita Cruz, and they were pretty fast friends. And they would have fun. And so my grandfather was upset, and he didn't fire them. He suspended them for like a week or 2 weeks, like we were in school again. But he wanted to have her back because he really loved Shirley. Okay, so what did he do here when he got here? Well, first when he was in San Francisco, he's an entrepreneur. You probably figured that one out. And he started Flores Press on Mendel Street in San Francisco in 1926. And I still have the plaque from the building. It's in my office. And as the name would say, press, printing, but he also had neighborhood throwaways, advertisers, where for Guam's neighborhood you got the same thing, only different advertisers than for Cause's neighborhood type of stuff. And when he moved back here, my father went to work and took that over the years. But when he came back here, we have a lot of Amas in our family, Lagrimas. His mother was Lagrimas, and Ama's father, and my grandfather, and their other brother, Ken, they all had different fathers, which explains being a Flores. And my grandfather's father was an English doctor that my grandmother met on a whaling boat. She had taken what would be, I believe, Alma's grandfather to Manila for medical care. Wasn't successful, so she was coming back, met the doctor. About 9 months later, my grandfather came around town. But she died when he was 26. So he was reared by the Perez family. And I believe where the bank is, actually where Flores Brothers used to be, is where they grew up. Because Felix Camacho's mom was in my office one day, 8 years ago, and she goes, I remember this so well, but when we were children, we'd run from here over to Plaza de Susana. And I said to me right then, I think that's where my grandfather grew up. And you know better? Make it up. Okay. And so he was reared by the Perez family, so, he knows Felix's mom, the late Frank D. Perez, his first cousin, Pete Perez, Pedro Perez. They were all fast friends. In fact, Pete Perez wrote the eulogy for my grandfather, and Simon's father, Doc Sanchez, delivered the eulogy for my grandfather. They were very, very close. And when my grandfather was governor, Doc Sanchez was the secretary, which is now called lieutenant governor. So he was my grandfather as lieutenant governor. He started the newspaper, Guam Daily News, Pacific Press, in 1951, when the island was going from the Department of Navy to Interior. And Navy was getting rid of a lot of their assets. And they had the newspaper for sale. So he and his gang raised their hand and said, we'll buy it. And that's how the Guam Daily News came about. And then it was a 6-day-a-week publication on Sundays. Territorial Sun would come out. I say it's gang because they were. It was Don Pedro Martinez, Jake Calvo, Frank Perez, and others whose names, at least if you've been around a while or you're from Guam, you know these names. And over the years, they helped Ada Butler from Butler's, Ignacio Butler, from Butler's Emporium at the top of the hill. And they came together and they started the company. And a lot of them started their own companies back then. In fact, we were talking about Don Pedro Martinez the other day because he used to raise cattle and he tried to grow apples. And my grandfather told about how around the apple trees, he would put ice, because they had a lot of ice, Pedro's ice plant. And over the years, they bought each other out from their different companies. And I remember the Cowboys were part of Guam Savings, and my grandfather was part of what was called PCC, Pacific Construction Company, and they traded shares. And he bought out Mrs. Butler. He bought out a lot of them and traded back their shares to them. And that's how he became majority owner of Guam Savings and Loan Association in 1954. But let me digress back to the Navy and the starting of the newspaper in 1951. They also had a bank, the Navy did, called the Bank of Guam, not the Bank of Guam as we know it today, but their own naval bank. And so the gang raised their hand again. And the officer of the Controller of Currency, OCC, said, no, you guys don't know anything about banking. We're going to give it to Bank of America. And so my grandfather had a very good friend back in San Francisco, Elwood Hanson, who had Bayview Savings and Loan Association, where our other grandmother, after our other grandfather died in 1954, she started a realty office, Tripney Realty, in that same building. Anyway, he said, Elwood, they won't let me do a bank. How do I do a savings and loan? And that's how Guam Savings and Loan came about. On July 4th, we opened our doors, 1954. Mariana's Finance opened their doors on the same day. They were both located where the DNA building is now in Agana. That was the Pacific Press building where they built, my grandfather was publishing the paper. The reason he started both of those, because back when I was in 1935 Homeowners Act, after the Great Depression, how the banking and insurance industries were organized. And I'm saying that you could only do residential lending, whereas Mariana's Finance could do a personal loan. Back then, the personal loan was $250, $500 per person. But this allowed people to offer both of those services. He built the bank in Agania, where my office is, and he started that on February 6th, 1960. I only know the date because it's the same date as my granddaughter's birthday, and there's a picture of it in one of our meeting rooms upstairs, artist rendition of what it was going to look like. And where I have my office in the bank is actually where Mariana's Finance used to be. He moved them over from the Civic Press meeting building also. So they had both of them back to back, and then we opened up in Mariana's Finance. We went together with Hawaii Bancorp, the old name for the holding company, or maybe it was Bancorp of Hawaii, I forget which one. And they approached us because they wanted a piece of Mariana's Finance, and my grandfather negotiated, sold him 51%. I think it was like one of the most unhappy days of his life. And Bank of Hawaii, we both had, it was a bad marriage. We both made promises, and Bank of Hawaii, sorry Brian, Bank of Hawaii didn't fulfill theirs. My grandfather said, hey, what's going on? So they said to him, well, we'll give a price. And you either buy us out of that share or we'll buy you out of that share. And my grandfather said, okay, I'm coming out of school, my MBA, I'm so smart. I'm almost like kicking him under the table. Don't take it. Well, of course, he's much smarter. And he took it, and we bought them out. And so that was part of the history of Mariana's Finance. And with that, then we built, he was still around. In 1974, we opened up our Tumuni office, and we had a Mariana's Finance office there. Then we realized we really didn't need two offices for Mariana's Finance, so we closed down in Agania, the MSC office, and moved that solely to Tumuni. And my grandfather's office, he was always very, very tight. And that old thing, be brutal on costs. And we punched out the wall, the main entrance, and moved the board meeting there and his office there. And for that time, we spent a fair amount of money, and he put in the cheapest carpet you could ever believe. It's like you wouldn't even put it in your house. But that's Grandpa. He did some other things too. The person who led the majors, I think still does, in strikeouts is Babe Ruth. So no one hits 1,000. He started Guam Airlines, or Guam Air, in Inter-Island Hopper, and it flew away during Typhoon Karen. He started Pacific American Insurance, and that also flew away during Typhoon Karen. And the company had no money, had a ton of claims, and my grandfather paid him out of his pocket. And when he told me that story, that was a huge lesson. And he did some other stuff. Of course, he built the apartments up in Agania Heights, and we built some other properties. And he worked like the devil until he died in 81. And I remember my dad, we called up my dad, and he goes, Ed, or son, I'm telling you I'm gonna retire. And my dad said, again? Because he just kept working and working and working. And my grandmother said that, she thinks that he liked problems because he had something to solve. And working under him, Jake knew him, working under him was wonderfully difficult because he just beat the heck out of me every day. And, praise in public, discipline in private. He'd walk into my desk and he'd just start telling me things, and I'd say, okay. I think he was trying to figure out if I was strong enough, smart enough to handle the companies. He thought I was, so he didn't make another mistake. But he'd also, he'd have lighter times, and he never talked about his mom. And I don't know if your dad did, but my dad said that Grandpa hardly ever talked about his mother. I think she is one of those buried in Sumai. And on Liberation Day, when they have a mass down there, I've often thought of going there just to see if she's there, her headstone or whatever it would be from 1915 or something like that. But he started the Republican Party of Guam in 1964. He did it with the late former Governor Camacho, Carlos Camacho, Kurt Moylan, and the late Judge Ben Regis. And at that time we had the territorial parties and the Popular Party. Popular Party was what is now the Democrats. The territorial was what is now the Republican Party. And the territorial party had a huge majority in our legislature, and they just did such a terrible job that my grandfather said, we're going to start a Republican Party. Because during his years in San Francisco, he was a pretty active member of the Republican Party in the city. And they called him, they being the White House, in 1959, 1958, and up to that point, all of our governors were appointed. He was appointed, he wasn't elected. And they were all just political plum that you get for being a good Democrat or good Republican. And they wanted to appoint somebody locally. And so they asked my grandfather, and he said, no, I'm a businessman. And they said, well, if you don't take it, we're gonna appoint somebody from outside of Guam again. So he said, okay, I'll do it. And his inauguration was July 7th, 1960. Just so happens the same day, the anniversary of Guam Savings, now Bank Pacific. And like I said, Doc was his lieutenant governor. And then they asked him, because I read the transcript of his hearing, and they asked him, well, because the election was coming up that year, if a Democrat gets elected president, will you resign? And he said yes. So I think they said, okay, we're gonna pick you. So when President Kennedy was elected, he went to Washington and met personally with the president, gave him his letter of resignation, and it was accepted. Then the new governor, I think Bennett, I forget his name, maybe somebody else will recall it, came out from Texas. And he and my grandfather were pretty good friends too. And then in 1964, 68, I guess it was, when the Republicans took back the administration of Washington, they asked him if he would be governor again. And he goes, no, I don't want to be. And so the Republican Party at that point had some legs, or about to get some legs. And they got together and they said, let's put together Carlos Camacho. So they suggested Carlos Camacho to the president, and that's how Carlos became our governor, and Kurt Moylan his lieutenant governor. We didn't start electing governors, as most of you probably know, until 1970. And that's so Carlos then became our governor. Camacho then became the first elected governor from our island, and Kurt Moylan being the first lieutenant governor. I'm hesitant to, sometimes when talking to King Cook, he keeps referring to his mother as the governor. I said, King, get off it, she's your mother. Just call it Governor Mom. And he'd chuckle, but people would come into my grandfather's office, and as I was going through boot camp, he'd invite me to a lot of meetings, and I couldn't get it that people who didn't know him would refer to him as Joe. I always thought, he's the governor. You're the governor. Call him Governor Flores or Governor. Just don't call him your name like your long time buddy. But that was my grandfather. It's okay with him. But now today, I will always call the governor's governor, whether it be Governor Felix, Governor Eddie, of course, Governor Paul Cabo, whom is aging I haven't seen for a couple of years now. I'm trying to think of more because it's not hard. My grandfather, my first trip to Guam was in 1954. I had my 5th birthday here in November. And I didn't realize it at the time because he just started the bank in Marianas Finance, and my dad came out to give him a hand. And where the bank is now in Tamuning, they lived in a Quonset hut. And in 1950s in Guam, there were a lot of Quonset huts. Why? Because they could deflect the wind. And it was my first typhoon experience, and I thought it was so cool to hear stuff bouncing off the building. And I had no idea that it was a destructive typhoon. And he used to like to eat his rice with butter and Parmesan cheese. He always said that's how the Marines ate their rice. And it was right, it was pretty darn good. And we built that building, then we built, at that time, he had, next door, he had a hot dogs and hamburger stand, and he sold cars. He sold Sunbeam Alpines and Hillmans. And so there he was, he's in his 60s, and he's got a picture of himself, a little Sunbeam Alpine, which is like a two-seater, convertible with his top down. So he liked cars. And if you like cars, might as well deal them. And that's just the way he was. He was also a pretty dapper dresser. And he always wore a shirt and tie. When we go out to dinner, I'd have to put on a tie. Every day at work, I'd have to put on a tie. And we were about the only people in the restaurant each time who had a tie. And he also, at the apartments up in Agania Heights, he had Phil Flores restaurant. And we go there every night for dinner. And he'd order the same thing after a while, and he'd leave a booming tip of 25 cents. I remember that part. And my grandmother, he never made money there. But he said to my grandmother, yeah, we're not making money, but we're just doing it. You know what I'm talking about, right, son? You'd always call me son. I said, yeah, Grandpa. I had no idea what he was talking about at the time. And I said, yeah. One of my favorite memories is Typhoon Pamela. And when we were youngsters, we grew up in a town called Atherton, which is right by Stanford University. My grandmother was visiting, she was staying with us, and I was staying at the house, and she got a letter from my grandfather after Karen saying he's sitting at the kitchen table looking up where the roof used to be. And so they rebuilt the house with a kind of special material. I'm not going to say it's cement asbestos, but I just did. It might have been cement asbestos. And it was built to insulate, help keep the house warm, cool. And during Pamela, I was over there at their place, and because I lived next door at the apartments, and the roof started to go. And there he is on the shelves trying to save pictures. I said, Grandpa, we need to get out of here. Well, the eye came right over. It was my first experience witnessing the eye, because during the eye of the storm, maybe several of you have seen it or been there for one, it's absolutely clear. It's a beautiful day. So we went next door to my apartment. My grandmother she was kind of frail the last decade. And I carried her up the stairs, and she'd had somebody cook a big roast. And so that night we had the roast, a bottle of Chivas, and we played cards. It was really, really a lot of fun. They had to move into one of the apartments. Two of the apartments up there are 5 bedrooms. They moved into one of them, and they lived there for over a year after somebody had to rebuild the house into what it looks like now. And they were tough at it. Like I said, my grandmother, she was bedridden, she had emphysema. When I came out, I said, I'm gonna go for at least 3 years. I gotta stick it out. I'm not staying more than 5. I'm going up to California. Had a girlfriend, I wanted to get married. I didn't want to live in Guam. But then because of that, I became somewhat of a caretaker, and I'm staying. And he passed away in 81. She died in 82. They died 6 weeks apart. He had the foresight to buy a piece of property in Windward Hills from a guy who was trying to do a pre-need cemetery. And the guy went bankrupt. And my grandfather and the gang bought the property at bankruptcy sale in '68. And over the years, been at it, we tried to talk him into going into the funeral business. And then after he passed, he would try to talk me into it. And I said, no, it's like, wait, you're 10 years old, someone says, what do you want to be when you grow up? I want to have a cemetery. But I was at Beagle Cemetery twice within 6 weeks. And I said, this is it? This is the best cemetery we have? So I got in touch with Ben and made our connection with Loyola Memorial Parks in the Philippines, whom we've since bought out. But built that where Our Lady of Peace now in Windward Hills, built that on that piece of property that my grandfather and his buddies bought in 1968. And I don't know why he would buy a cemetery property. I don't know if he did it for the price or if he just, because he saw that, you know, we're gonna run out of space one day and we're gonna have to build cemeteries somewhere. I suspect it was the latter. Anyway, that's about the story of my grandfather. He was really a good person. And he would beat me up again just to see if I could take it, if I could do it. And sometimes I just wanted to walk out the door, because he always threatened, I'm gonna send you back. After a while, of hearing that, you go, well, okay. And I'm glad I didn't, because I really, of course, enjoy and love my life here in Guam. I was just telling the ladies, next month it'll be 50 years that I came out to join my grandfather and his companies. And I still look forward, Jake will tell you this, I still look forward, and Kyle's tell you this, and Bob will tell you this, I still look forward to going to my office every day, getting up and having something to do. And not just having something to do, but to lead. And I got that from my grandfather. My father was an entrepreneur too, on a much smaller scale. And our other grandfather, who I said died in 1954 of a stroke and a heart attack, which because medicine was much different back then. He was an entrepreneur too. He was born in Palermo. And he, my sister knows where this is going. The Sicilians, bootleggers. So my grandfather on the other side was a bootlegger, and then he eventually went into San Francisco Fishing Company with Mayor Alioto. I'm not sure how many of us know that name. A very strong figure in San Francisco, with his brother, excuse me, his father, and they started San Francisco Fishing Company. We had my godfather was also Sicilian. My mom was Italian, she was Italian. Our grandfather was Sicilian. We had a lot of really good food, and they were all bootleggers. And when I came out to Guam in '73, I went to Payless, and there was pickled herring from Lasco, Los Angeles Smelting Company, which belonged to my mother's side of the family, my other grandfather's side of the family. And then they had another company, the second largest liquor distributor in Southern California, called Bohemian Liquors. So we used to kid my grandmother, bootleggers. She never denied it. And we were all we all had fun with it. And I think that's it. The story of my grandfather. Any questions?
So did they start the fishing company so they have the vessels to move bootleg liquor, or?
Oh, I'm sorry, say it again.
Did they start the fishing company so that they have the vessels to move the liquor that they're bootlegging and getting?
I wonder what happened to all the bootleg liquor. But our great grandmother, Petrali, she had a ranch on the bay in San Francisco. So, okay, what's a better place to have a ranch during the bootlegging days? On the bay. So, and that was right down the street from where my mother and her brother were born, on Rivera Street in San Francisco. And back in those days, because my mom was born in 22, 23, I think, maybe. And, you knew everybody from the neighborhood. She and my father both grew up in what's called Bayview District, and that's how they met me. And their best friends were this other couple, the Campbells, and the wife was like one of my mom's best friends as a child, and my husband Bill was like one of my dad's friends growing up. They both went to USF. They both were in the Navy together, and that's it. Thank you.